No one in that courtroom saw it coming. When Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett fixed her gaze on Karoline Leavitt, the youngest press secretary in U.S. history, the message was clear. Sit down and know your place. With a sharp tone and all the weight of the bench behind her, Barrett tried to shut Leavitt down in front of the entire judicial panel. "This isn't a campaign rally, Miss Leavitt," she said coldly. But what happened next left even the most seasoned legal minds stunned. Karoline didn't flinch. She calmly opened her notes, cited precedent, and delivered a razor-sharp legal response that flipped the narrative and earned more than a few raised eyebrows in the room. This wasn't just another political hearing. This was a young conservative woman standing toe-to-toe with one of the most powerful judges in the country, and holding her own like a seasoned legal heavyweight. Before we show you exactly how it unfolded, drop a comment with where you're watching from, and make sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss more political moments the mainstream media won't touch. It was a crisp October morning in Washington, D.C., the kind where the air feels charged with history waiting to be made. News vans lined the sidewalks outside the Supreme Court. Protesters from both sides of the ideological divide had gathered in droves, some waving pocket constitutions, others holding signs demanding tighter digital speech regulation, but none of them were chanting the name of a politician or a billionaire CEO. They were chanting for Karoline Leavitt. At just 28 years old, she had already been the youngest White House press secretary in U.S. history. Now she stood as the lone defender of her conservative media company, Freedom Press Incorporated, accused of violating federal mandates that demanded government-approved content moderation across all platforms. The case, United States v. Freedom Press Inc., had quietly climbed through the courts. Now it had landed before the highest bench in the land. The question was massive. Could the government use bureaucratic mandates to force private media companies to suppress politically sensitive viewpoints? Justice Amy Coney Barrett, seated dead center on the bench, was expected to bring the fire. Known for her constitutional strictness and intellectual precision, she was both feared and respected by courtroom veterans. The room buzzed as she leaned into her microphone. "Ms. Leavitt," she said, cool and direct, "your company has ignored 14 compliance notices issued under the Communications Integrity Mandate. Will you explain why you believe yourself above this court's legal framework?" The audience hushed. Karoline stood, calm, collected, Constitution in hand. "With respect, Justice Barrett," she said, her voice calm but resonant, "I'm not here because I think I'm above the law. I'm here because I still believe in it." A ripple spread through the room. "I didn't ignore those mandates," she continued. "I challenged them. Because the First Amendment wasn't written to protect the comfortable, it was written to defend the controversial." Even Justice Alito glanced up from his notes. Barrett's eyes narrowed. "You're representing yourself?" "Yes, Your Honor, I've read every precedent, reviewed every statute, and I'm here to defend what should never need defending, the right to speak freely in America." Justice Barrett straightened. "You claim that the Communications Integrity Mandate violates the First Amendment, yet the law was passed with bipartisan support and survived multiple circuit court challenges." Karoline didn't waver. "I'm aware of that, Your Honor, and with all due respect, popularity does not equal constitutionality." The crowd buzzed again. Barrett's voice sharpened. "Ms. Leavitt, do you understand the gravity of what you're asserting? You are a private citizen accusing the federal government of weaponizing regulatory language to suppress ideological dissent." "I do," Karoline said, stepping forward, "because I've lived it." She raised a folder. "In this file are internal emails from the Office of Digital Standards Enforcement, obtained through a faux IA request. They clearly discuss flagging and suppressing content labeled as rural right-wing misinformation." Barrett's brow arched. Karoline continued. "In these same emails, they reference my platform, by name. They discuss how to apply pressure through risk of license suspension to ensure compliance. She placed the folder on the evidence table. Justice Barrett, we didn't defy law. We defied tyranny dressed in legal language. Justice Sotomayor leaned forward, clearly listening. Justice Thomas raised a brow. Karoline pressed on. In Netshield versus Paxton, your own majority opinion, Justice Barrett, you wrote that no regulatory body may compel private entities to mirror government perspectives under the guise of compliance enforcement. Barrett blinked. You're using my own precedent against me. I'm using it because it's true. Silence. Karoline took a breath. I didn't come here to score political points. I came because our Constitution is not a decoration, it's a defense. And I am not just defending my company. I'm defending every American who's ever been told to sit down and shut up. She turned to the gallery. To the veterans who wore the uniform to defend liberty. To the pastors who risk fines to preach truth. To the parents whose voices are censored for asking questions about schools. I stand here for you. The audience erupted into spontaneous applause until Chief Justice Roberts banged his gavel. Order, he said, but even he looked shaken. Justice Barrett leaned back. This wasn't the woman she expected. This wasn't a pundit. This was a constitutionalist. And the fire had just started. The temperature inside the Supreme Court wasn't warm, but Karoline Leavitt radiated a fire that made it feel as if something far greater than legal precedent was unfolding. Justice Amy Coney Barrett stared down from the bench, her tone cautious, her words sharp. Ms. Leavitt, you've made serious allegations regarding the intent of federal enforcement. You understand the implications of that? Karoline didn't flinch. I do, Your Honor. That's why I brought proof. She walked to the evidence table and opened a binder labeled FOIADISCL-OSURESDOJSLASHOINTERAGENCY. These communications, she said, show coordination between unelected federal officials and outside fact-checking organizations designed to suppress ideological dissent, conservative dissent. Barrett raised an eyebrow. Karoline turned to page 14. Here, an official from the Office of Digital Standards Enforcement wrote, and I quote, "While we can't directly ban them, we can increase non-compliance pressure to break them economically." A collective murmur rolled through the courtroom. Justice Thomas leaned forward. Justice Kagan whispered something to Justice Sotomayor. Karoline's voice didn't shake. I'm not a lawyer by training, but I've studied every ruling that affects speech in this country, and in Netshield v. Paxton, Justice Barrett herself wrote, when government power leverages regulation to silence speech, it becomes indistinguishable from censorship. She paused. Her hands rested calmly on the podium. This case isn't about my business. It's about a dangerous precedent where unelected bureaucrats act as silencers under the cloak of compliance. Barrett narrowed her eyes, scanning the page. You believe that this mandate was crafted with ideological motive? Yes, ma'am. Not only crafted, but weaponized. She flipped to another page. Here's another quote. From a May 2023 internal call summary, Freedom Press and similar outlets remain the last holdouts. If we can't silence them outright, we'll drown them in compliance reviews until they go quiet. Even the most hardened court watchers hadn't seen this coming. Karoline stepped back. This wasn't regulation. It was retaliation. The courtroom didn't erupt. It inhaled. Every justice sat still. Even the clerks, typically whispering and shuffling notes, stared forward. Justice Barrett adjusted her seat. Ms. Leavitt, you're quoting me accurately, and if your documentation holds up, this court is indeed facing a challenge to the First Amendment unlike any it has seen in recent memory. Karoline nodded once, steady. Then I've done what I came here to do. Barrett looked at the binder again, flipping to the tab labeled Suppression Protocols, Undisclosed Docket Memorandums. Her expression shifted. It wasn't political, it was judicial. For the first time in the session, Caroline's youth disappeared, and what remained was something timeless, a citizen armed with truth. She turned back to the justices, then to the gallery. "I know what the media is saying," she began, voice low but firm. "They say I'm too young, that I'm in over my head, that I should have brought a team of lawyers." She looked at Barrett. "But I read your words, Justice, and I believed them." The audience was still. Somewhere in the back, a veteran removed his cap. "I believe this court was still the last line of defense when politics tried to disguise control as compliance." She held up her pocket constitution. "I came not as a press secretary, not as a CEO, but as an American, because when they told me to choose between my voice and my license, I chose my voice." A soft exhale rippled through the room. It wasn't dramatic, it was reverent. Caroline looked out at the room. The old veterans, the grandmothers clutching rosaries, the farmers in stiff Sunday suits who had waited hours just to witness one moment of someone finally standing up. And then she said the line that would appear on every screen in America before sundown. "If compliance means silence, then freedom is no longer free, and I refuse to pay that price." Justice Thomas glanced toward Chief Justice Roberts. Justice Alito leaned back, visibly struck. Justice Barrett placed her pen down and addressed the entire room. "This court will recess to further review these disclosures." As the gavel echoed, Caroline didn't break into a smile. She didn't collapse into her chair. She simply closed her binder, slipped her constitution back into her coat pocket, and nodded respectfully toward the bench. Outside, the world was already changing. Veterans saluted. Reporters stood frozen, not sure how to spin what they had just witnessed. And online, clips exploded. "Nar, Leavitt speaks. Forrest, Shanar, freedom is still legal. Shanar, she-faced. The court, Shanar, Barrett." Listen's news hosts, even though skeptical, called it one of the most stunning displays of constitutional command ever witnessed by a non-attorney in the highest court. But back inside the building, something more powerful had happened. Justice Barrett, a woman known for her surgical legal mind and ideological steel, sat back in her chair and whispered to a clerk, "She came ready, and she made me think again. And sometimes, that's all it takes to turn the tide of a nation." Weeks passed. Outside the marble pillars of the Supreme Court, the protests faded. The media's spin quieted. But within those solemn chambers, something louder remained. The echoes of a young woman's voice, unflinching, alone, and anchored in truth. When the court reconvened, the nation held its breath. Justice Amy Coney Barrett authored the majority opinion. She didn't open with fire or legal jargon. She opened with principle. The Constitution prohibits the use of regulatory enforcement as a veil to suppress protected speech. When a citizen comes prepared with truth, the law must answer, not intimidate. She never mentioned Karoline Leavitt by name. She didn't have to. The decision was swift and unanimous. The federal mandates were halted. Regulatory agencies lost their ability to enforce ideology through compliance threats. Every lower court ruling that had previously favored the government was reversed. Legal scholars across the country called it a generational reaffirmation of the First Amendment. The headlines told the story. Leavitt's stand rewrites the digital Constitution. The Federalist, Barrett bows to principle, and a young patriot, National Review. Court delivers, blow to federal overreach in speech case. Fox News, she wasn't a lawyer, she was right. Even the New York Times. But the impact wasn't just legal, it was personal. In places the Beltway forgets, Bentonville, Arkansas, Minot, North Dakota, Pueblo, Colorado, Akron, Ohio, ordinary people felt something they hadn't felt in years. Seen, heard, defended. At a VFW hall in Tennessee, an 89-year-old Korean war vet stood beside a grainy TV and saluted when the court's ruling was announced. In a church basement in rural Wisconsin, a group of elderly women met for Bible study and wept when they saw the clip of Karoline standing alone before 9 justices and saying, "I refuse to pay silence as the price of freedom." In Iowa, a teenager from a farming family wrote to Karoline, "I've always been scared to speak in class, but I watched you stand up to the Supreme Court, and now I think I can raise my hand too." Karoline didn't respond to the ruling with a press conference. She didn't schedule a victory tour. She went home. That Sunday morning, in a small New Hampshire church with creaky pews and chipped hymnals, Karoline walked in quietly, sat in the back, and bowed her head. The pastor mid-sermon looked up. He paused. Then he pointed to her pew. "Church," he said, voice trembling. "That's what courage looks like." No applause, no cameras, just tears, and a reverence too deep for words. Karoline didn't speak. She didn't rise. She whispered one prayer. "Thank you, Lord, for giving me the strength to stand when it was easier to sit." The days that followed weren't filled with media attention. They were filled with letters, thousands, from every state, from people Karoline had never met, but who felt like she had spoken for them. A grandmother in Alabama. "I raised 4 children with my husband on a single paycheck. We didn't always agree with politicians, but we taught our kids to tell the truth. Watching you, I felt like truth finally got its turn." A high school history teacher from Montana. "I almost quit my job after being reprimanded for teaching about the Bill of Rights. Your case gave me the courage to keep going." A prison inmate in Pennsylvania. "I made mistakes. I lost my way. But when I saw you speak, not with hate, but with hope, I remembered what America was supposed to feel like." Karoline read every letter. She didn't see herself as a hero. She saw herself as a mirror, not the loudest voice, but the voice that gave others permission to remember their own. In a later interview, a reporter asked her, "Did you really believe you could win against the entire federal government?" Karoline smiled softly. "I didn't show up to win. I showed up to remind them they don't own our voices." He pressed again. "What gave you the strength?" She pointed to her pocket constitution. "That, and the people who don't have microphones. I stood because they couldn't." As the leaves changed in Washington, something else did too. Professors began teaching the Leavitt doctrine in constitutional law classes. Churches played her testimony as modern-day Esther. And in homes across America, people who had gone silent started speaking again. They didn't quote Karoline because she was famous. They quoted her because she was right. If compliance means silence, then freedom is no longer free. I refuse to pay that price. Is freedom still legal? Karoline went back to her life, her home, her husband, her newborn son. But the world she returned to had shifted, not because power was toppled, but because one voice, humble, clear, unshaken, had cracked the armor of intimidation. And in that crack, truth rushed in. And now, do you believe one voice still matters in America? Comment below. Tell us where you were when you heard Karoline speak. Did she speak for you too? Subscribe for more stories where truth walks in, and even the powerful must listen. Because in an age of silence and surrender, conviction remains our loudest defense.